Speak is Deputy Daly, Deputy of 20 minutes.
Thanks, John Corla. I note that Deputy McGuinness made the point that would a Republican dip their hands into the pockets of citizens? Well, if that Republican was a member of Fianna Fáil, then they certainly would. I'm not a Republican. I'm an international socialist, and my criticism of government is, in fact, that they continued the policies of Fianna Fáil in taking money out of the pockets of citizens in order to pay back debts that were never ours in the first place. And I think that we can't discuss the budget without putting it in the context of the debacle around Irish Water on the one hand and what's going on in the economy in general on the other. We had a discussion here this morning about our defence forces and frightening statistics that 20% of soldiers in our defence forces are so poorly paid that they have to rely on FIS payments coming out of the Department of Social Protection's budget. So in effect, the race to the bottom in terms of wages, which is going on not just in the private sector but in the public sector as well, is putting an enormous strain on social protection in order to bring people up to a certain level of decency, the baseline, if you like. And I'm not going to repeat points that have been well articulated here with the terrible stories of citizens who are in the category of the working poor and people who are just simply sick of managing. They're working harder and longer than they were a number of years ago for less pay. They're being told by the Taoiseach and the government that the economy is improving, that things are getting better, but they're not feeling it. And those people, onto their shoulders has been foisted the issue of having to deal with and pay a new water bill. And I do agree with Deputy McGuinness from the point when he says that Irish Water now should be abolished and we should fund our water infrastructure through general taxation. I'd be more in favour of that taxation being increased on the high earners and the corporations. But it is ironic that we had reports this morning when we talk about budgets and not being able to do enough for people on social protection. And we're told that the hundreds of millions going into Irish Water, the myth that that's going to improve conservation was debunked this morning, with the regulator even confirming statistics which show that it will not have an impact on water conservation, with only a reduction of about 6% through the introduction of water churches, confirming actually analysis done years ago which said that the installation of water meters was not economically viable position. And yet the government and the taxpayer is underwriting Irish Water's investment to the tune of hundreds of millions to facilitate a useless process that will not in any way contribute to that. And the reason why I pose this now is that they are hundreds of millions which could have been used absolutely to repair our water infrastructure, which is necessary, but which also could be used to ease the burden of people on social protection payments. And I do think that our contributions in this part of the bill is not really about so much as what's in it as what isn't in it and what should have been in it. And I do think, and other deputies have made points about it, is the treatment of carers has been absolutely reprehensible in the lifetime of this government. And if we had a greater flexibility in this budget, which we had, then payments and the restoration of the full respite care grant should have been dealt with to the 40,000 full-time carers, because although that is a payment that's supposed to be used to deal with people for respite, everybody knows that because of the cumulative cutbacks that these families have already endured, that the grant isn't always used for that, but in many instances it's actually used for essentials, for paying heating, for paying electricity, in some instances food, clothes and so on. And the stories are out there, everybody knows them, about families going into having to sell their cars, not being able to turn on their heating and so on because of the cutbacks in these payments. And it's a false economy, because the carers' health then becomes impacted upon and they can't do that job, and then they too become, if you like, a cost to the exchequer, apart and all from the inhumane human cost that it's been done to those people who are playing such an important role in our society. I think another area which the Minister, the the Minister made a lot of play on was the whole issue of one-parent families and the changes to that system, where she said previously in 2012 that 7 was too young to look at removing the one-parent family, and that her goal was to bring us up to Scandinavian models in terms of childcare. Now, you know, the point about this is, if the Minister agrees that 7 is too young for the payments to be stopped, well, they are being stopped, and where are the measures to bring in affordable childcare? I don't think anybody realistically expected the Scandinavian model to be delivered, but why not even have the benefit of tax relief in the budget towards childcare costs? Nothing there. And unless this is dealt with, then the issue of the poverty endured by one-parent families, who are primarily women, is actually going to continue. And we should note that, you know, Ireland, along with the United States, has the highest childcare costs in the world and the highest birth rate in Europe, but we're not dealing with this or the levels of child poverty, which are absolutely out there. I think another area which isn't in it and has caused huge heartache, and I know the Minister is well aware of this one, is the area of pensioners. And obviously the pension levy is having an impact on people's income in their retirement years, but other changes brought in previous social welfare and pensions bills under the lifetime of this government mean that currently, as we speak, measures that are taking place in some pension schemes are going to have a significant detrimental impact on the livelihood of citizens. And I'm particularly talking about the aviation pension scheme and the 15,000 members of that scheme. Some of them active contributors, some of them people who've left their employment whose pension is deferred, and some of them who are already on a pension payment. Now, when we talk about a crisis in funding of pension schemes, I think we'd all probably agree with that there is a crisis of funding. But what isn't agreed is, how do you deal with that crisis and who's responsible for it? And there are measures that the government can bring in as part of this bill, which I know all members of the opposition will be pushing strongly at committee stage in order to deal with this inequality. And it has to be dealt with, because if we don't deal with this now under this bill, it means that in 6 weeks' time, in the new year, thousands of citizens, existing pensioners, will be subjected to a 6-week loss in their earnings on top of the other cutbacks that are out there in terms of the existing pensioners. And in terms of deferred pensioners, some of those people are going to see an absolute decimation of their livelihoods. And is that good enough? Well, it obviously isn't, and it's not those people's fault. So why should they bear the cost of that? Because they had a reasonable and legitimate expectation that they would have a certain standard of living on their retirement. Membership of that scheme was a condition, actually, of their employment. They couldn't get out of it. They had no choice in it. And actually, through no fault of their own now, they're seeing their livelihoods potentially being decimated. And yet their colleagues in the United States and in Britain, who also work for the national airline, didn't have to endure that cut in any way. And I think too much has been done to protect the employer in this situation and to expect pensioners to bear the cost. And we can deal with this in this bill at committee stage, because the reality is there was a funding problem with that scheme. Absolutely no question or doubt about it. But the primary blame for that problem rested on the shoulders of the employers. And it's not just me saying that. I mean, the High Court has already adjudicated on these matters. Mr. Justice Murphy, when he deemed the IAS scheme to be a contingent creditor in terms of Aer Lingus, when the company tried previously to move some monies around. The court ruled that Aer Lingus owed the pension scheme over 500 million. Now, what they're putting into that now as part of the new deal is not nearly a fraction of that money, and yet the company is highly profitable. It benefited from the exit of thousands of employees before their normal retirement date, and yet it's now expecting those people to bear the cost of that for what was a legitimate responsibility on their part. I think it has to be said as well that one of the huge contributing factors here is the appalling investment decisions made by the trustees of that pension scheme, trustees that this government is seeking to further empower. To put it mildly and as politely as I can, some of the decisions made by those trustees were at best ill-judged and ill-timed, and to put it mildly, very, very peculiar. When they sold off 1.4 billion of assets as part of a freeze and de-risk strategy at a time when property portfolios were increasing, when properties that they essentially sold off at rock-bottom prices increased in value very shortly after that. Who's been expected to pay the price of that? The deferred and the existing pensions, and indeed those who are still actively contributing to those pension schemes at the moment. And it really isn't good enough. And the reason why these groups are being disproportionately impacted upon is because of changes that we made to previous legislation in that regard. So we will be pushing this at committee stage. Minister, I think it's regrettable that the government itself hasn't done it. Hopefully maybe the Minister herself will move some of these at committee and we'll address them further. We'll move for an adjournment.